Hello everyone. Today I wanted to talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD, which is the complex post-traumatic stress disorder acronym, which in itself is quite a mouthful. It's quite heavy in terms of how it's phrased, and the whole thing feels very serious. So in this video, I wanted to talk about what is PTSD, what is complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD, what does all this mean? And is it all just anxiety, or is it something more serious that has to be managed in a complex way, as the name provides? The first thing to say is that post-traumatic stress disorder is just plain old anxiety. Now, when I say plain old anxiety, it's not to take away from any of the suffering that people experience who have been through traumatic events and now are feeling the stress on their nervous system as a result. It's awful, it's hellish, it's something you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the suffering or the end result or the anxiety state that you are now left with, if you've been through a series of traumatic events, one traumatic event, whatever it might be, is complex. It's actually very simple. It's a normal, understandable response to the stress that you've endured through the trauma, as the name implies, that you might have experienced in life. So that's all it is. All PTSD is, or complex PTSD, is just another manifestation of anxiety. If you've watched any of my videos, you know that anxiety, in the way I describe it, is caused by a highly sensitized nervous system. So stress over the years, weeks, months, and years have built up over time, over that period, to leave your your nervous system tired, fatigued, sensitized, and your flight or fight system, as a result, highly active. So it's now reacting to everyday thoughts, events, situations as though there's a physical imminent threat. And actually, PTSD is a really good example of how this mechanism works, as hard as it is for anyone who's experiencing it. So again, I don't want to take away from the suffering. The suffering is real, it's hard, but it doesn't mean we should actually overcomplicate it. In fact, the fact that the suffering is really tough should mean that we simplify it more and more, so people have the best chance of recovering from it. So again, if you think about PTSD, it just means that someone has experienced potentially highly stressful events, sometimes a one-off big, huge traumatic event. It could be multiple big traumatic events. It could be, smaller traumas, if there is such a thing. Anything that causes stress on the body that is not processed or dealt with, that we don't have the capacity to process, manage, release from the system, is going to, over time, leave us sensitized. The more of those events we experience without the ability to release and process those emotions in the form of energy, then it's going to leave us in this sensitized state where our nervous system becomes highly reactive, and we start to worry and react to different things or different triggers, even when the initial stresses that we were exposed to, or the traumatic events that we were exposed to, have long passed. The obvious example to talk about is those war veterans who have been exposed to war zones, or civilians who might have been in war zones. So this threat to life was very real, and there were very difficult events to experience, witnessing difficult events, harm, etc. And I don't need to go into all the variations of it. If anyone who's experienced it, I'm sure will know, or any other sort of trauma. But we can see pretty logically that if you're exposed to an event like that, a war zone, repeatedly over the years, and you don't have the ability to do anything about it, you've got to keep entering those war zones in order to survive, fight, defend, etc., then your nervous system's going to keep activating, and there's no ability really to reset, recharge in those scenarios, because you've got to be on. Because if you're not on, then there is a threat to life. So it makes sense that your nervous system and your corresponding flight or fight response is highly agitated and active. That makes sense, because for a sustained amount of time you had to be like that in order to survive. The problem is, of course, even years after you've left that scene, left those scenes, left those difficult environments, the conflict, your nervous system doesn't necessarily calm down straight away. And in fact, you might not realize how active your flight or fight response. So it might start to respond to different triggers or memories or reminders or dreams or sounds or noises, or you may not even sure what you're responding to. It might be everyday things. It could just be everyday uncertainty that comes up. And because your nervous system is so sensitized and agitated, it releases adrenaline, and you start to react with fear to these things that might be everyday triggers, sounds, noises, memories, etc., things that you watch on TV, whatever it might be. The triggers will be different for everyone, as though you're kind of still in that scenario, because your nervous system's learned that in order to survive, it needs to be on high alert. And that makes sense. Complex PTSD is what they actually talk about, people who've been exposed to multiple traumas over the years. And I get that, right? It makes sense that the more stressful things you experience, for anyone with anxiety, the more likely your nervous system is going to become sensitized, because it's harder to process, work through, release all that pent-up tension and energy. So that's what PTSD is. That's what complex PTSD is. There is nothing complex about it. It's the anxiety state that you are left in is a logical end result of this cumulative stress that, of course, we're not equipped to process, release, deal with, whatever, that leaves us in this highly reactive state potentially later in life. Now, whilst it feels really serious and it can be really intrusive into your life in terms of how it manifests, the more we understand this mechanism, the same way to recover from it is the same for any other anxiety or anxiety state manifestation. PTSD, I've mentioned, of course, OCD, panic attacks, agoraphobia, and you might have some of these alongside it, but it's all the same stuff. The more we try and make out that it's different or it's more complex, it's harder to recover from, it's different, the more stuck that we get, the more bewildered by the state that we're in. So the solution is, of course, to start to slowly desensitize the nervous system over time through all the techniques and methods I talk about on this channel. To start to allow the energy, knowing that it's just adrenaline, to process through the system as opposed to just react to it. It requires effort, it requires time, of course, to do it. We have to form a new habit, but that's actually all that's required. We have to start to learn that we're no longer reacting to a difficult memory, a thought, a sound. We're reacting to the release of adrenaline that's tricking us into reacting as though we were still experiencing a trauma from the past. So we don't even need to go into the traumas. We don't need to relive them. We don't revisit them. We just work with ourselves, our nervous system, whenever it's activated. That's the good news. You know the traumatic stuff. You know the stressful events. If you don't know, it's good to understand that you've had some, but most people can come to that pretty quickly. But we don't need to trawl through them. We don't need to go through all the trauma again. We just work with it when it arises, knowing ultimately it's adrenaline tricking you into worrying about that difficult memory, that sound, that noise, that person that reminds you of something. Whatever it is, an email, it can be anything for anyone, or it's different for all people. So that's all we have to do. We start to learn to desensitize. We've got to think about lifestyle as well, slowing down our life a bit, but working with the symptoms as they arise with true understanding of what they are. It's just the release of adrenaline, cortisol that we're reacting to. That's all it is, and all the methods and tools that I talk about in my videos are designed to help with that. But the key is to shift out of that bewildered state, to get to an understanding that actually I get what this is now. It's still really hard, still suffering, but I get how my nervous system has become so sensitized. It makes sense given what I've experienced. Now I have the opportunities to start to allow that tension and stress to process through the system, and I don't actually have to go over all the traumas and re-traumatize myself by doing so. I hope that makes sense. If you've got any questions, please let me know. But as always, I hope to see you again soon. Take care.